Great. In ancient times, there always lived a few men in every generation whom I, the evil one, could not corrupt in the usual manner. It was impossible to tempt them to murder, lechery, robbery. I could not even get them to cease studying the law. In one way only could the inner passions of these righteous be reached, through their vanity. In his famous short story, Zaidlus I, from which I just quoted the opening words, Nobel laureate Isaac Bashevis Singer recounts the tragic fate of the exceedingly erudite and affluent Zaidel, who upon the advice of Satan converts to Christianity to satisfy his ardent desire for renown. Christened with the name Benedictus, he ventures to write an all-encompassing refutation of the Talmud, which he hopes will secure him fame and a high position in the church. However, his perfectionism and his vanity prevent him from ever finishing his work. To make matters worse, he goes blind and is forced to resort to begging. Humbled by his own failure and while mumbling the Jewish prayers of his childhood, Zaidel ponders day in and day out the question if God exists or whether being is pointless, to which he ultimately finds an answer, despite dying alone and forgotten. In a similar vein, the story of the early modern convert and Zohar exegete, Moses Aaron of Kraków, alias Johan Christian Jakob, alias Johan Kemper of Uppsala, the central figure of this talk. His story also features a great deal of tragedy and several surprising twists. Born in Krakow around 1670 and orphaned of his father at a very young age, Moses Aaron grew up with his mother. Married upon turning 18, he was forced to seek employment as a melamed, a teacher in the German-speaking lands, far from his newly founded family. In 1695, he was involved with a movement that expected the imminent arrival of the Jewish Messiah. While being employed as a schoolmaster in a small Jewish community in rural Franconia, he became acquainted with a Lutheran minister and in 1696 converted to Christianity, receiving the name Johann Christian Jakob. Thereupon, he worked for some time for Johann Christoph Wagenseil, one of the most prolific Christian Hebraists of his time. In 1698, he settled in Sweden, where he changed his name once more to Johan Kemper. From 1701 onwards, he worked as a private tutor for Hebrew and rabbinic literature in the university town of Uppsala. It was there that he also composed exegetical works, most importantly, a comprehensive Christian exposition of the Zohar, the central work of medieval Jewish Kabbalah. He died in utter poverty in May 1716 in his adopted homeland. Just a little remark, I will refer to my protagonist with the names he bore at the time I'm dealing with. So keep in mind that Moses Aaron, Johann Christian Jakob, and Johann Kemper are one and the same person. What makes Singer's tale about Zaidel so compelling is the fact that he succeeded in masterfully combining fiction with both historical aspects of Jewish conversion to Christianity and stereotypes frequently connected to it. Hence, the stories of the fictitious Zaidel and the historic Johann Kemper have more in common than being eventful and tragic. Both Zaidel and Kemper continued after their conversions to occupy themselves with the writings of Judaism, investing their time and resources into penning major treatises against it. The hero of Singer's story wanted to go down in history as the author of the ultimate Christian refutation of the Talmud, a project he never managed to finish. The protagonist of our story aspired to put forward a thorough Christian reinterpretation of Kabbalah and wrote an all-encompassing Christological commentary on the Zohar that in turn he did not manage to publish. Taking scholarly research on Kemper into account, additional similarities emerge. Just like Zaidel, Kemper has been portrayed as someone who pursued his very own agenda, of which his Christian peers would have certainly disapproved had they been aware of it. Finally, both Seidel and Kemper have been depicted as thoroughly Jewish from the cradle to the grave. Seidel converted for utilitarian reasons without ever being convinced of the truth of Christianity. Similarly, Kemper has been portrayed in modern scholarly accounts as someone who abandoned Judaism out of frustration over failed messianism, while having essentially and secretly stayed a Jewish exegete until the end of his life. However, contrary to popular belief, Christianity was not particularly welcoming of converts from Judaism during most of the early modern period. There were no systematic attempts of missionizing Jews, and there was no infrastructure geared to the support of Jewish converts. Although it is almost impossible to determine what exactly caused a certain individual to embrace Christianity, it is relatively certain that in most cases, utilitarian reasons did not play a major part. Since conversion from Judaism to Christianity in the early modern period often meant downward social mobility, it was not attractive for Jews belonging to the scholarly or the financial elite. Since there was little to gain from conversion, it was equally unattractive for the lower strata of Jewish society. Who then were the people who abandoned Judaism in favor of Christianity? Mostly members of the so-called secondary religious elite. This is to say, cantors and schoolmasters like Moses Aaron, alias Johan Kemper, the protagonist of this lecture. To our ears, a Lutheran rabbi might sound bizarre, and it is certainly an oxymoron. However, as the historian David Ruderman has pointed out, the early modern period was not only the age of momentous geographical and scientific discoveries, but particularly for Jewry, also an era characterized by accelerated mobility, religious crisis, and blurring of, quote, religious and social boundaries between Jews and other Jews and between Jews and members of other faiths, unquote, thus facilitating the emergence of obvious oxymorons like Lutheran rabbis. Likewise, it is not immediately accessible how the three historical phenomena of Sabbatianism, conversion, and Christian Kabbalah that are invoked in the title of my lecture are connected. And indeed, the story that I will tell in the following might occasionally seem somewhat disconnected. However, it is at all times held together by the protagonist of my talk, in whom several distinctly early modern phenomena and intellectual currents crystallized. Moses Aaron, alias Johann Christian Jakob, alias Johan Kemper, provides a unique window into the struggles of an often voiceless strata of both early modern Jewish and Christian society. In what follows, we will explore through him three distinct historical phenomena. First, we will see how he, as a second-rank religious functionary, experienced and perceived late 17th century Jewish messianism. Second, we will look at the troubles, tribulations, and challenges that a conversion to Lutheran Christianity entailed in the beginning of the 18th century. Third, we will analyze the strategies that individuals like Kemper employed to tackle these challenges, which were in the case in question, among others, connected to the Christian interest in Jewish mysticism and theosophy, commonly known as Christian Kabbalah. In 1695, roughly 1 year before his conversion to Christianity, Moses Aaron of Kraków experienced a messianic upheaval precipitated by a certain Tzadok, who had predicted the redemption of Israel for said year. More precisely, Tzadok had predicted the glorious return of Shabtai Tzvi, who had thrown Jewry into turmoil in 1665 by proclaiming himself to be the promised Messiah, only to become a Muslim 1 year later. In his convert autobiography of 1696, entitled Untertäniger Bericht, or Humble Account in English, Aaron relates the antecedents of the messianic commotion in question as follows. In the meantime, the year was 1695 AD. The rumor that the Messiah was finally about to come spread among the Jews. A great fast day was proclaimed in all of Poland, Silesia, Moravia, and Bohemia, and everyone was advised to prepare for the arrival of the Messiah. This had been brought about by a Jew from Lithuania named Rabbi Tzadok, who it was claimed could work signs and wonders. The Kabbalists cited inter alia Genesis 2:21, "Vayisgor basa tachtena," and he, meaning God, closed up the flesh instead thereof, as evidence whereby they interpreted the word basa, meaning flesh or good news, as meaning the glad tidings of the arrival of the Messiah. The word tachtena, thereof, was divided in such a way that the first two letters, tach, tafret, were supposed to indicate the 408th year, which had witnessed rumors about the arrival of the Messiah as well, and which by then was 30 years past. The number of the remaining letters, tena, tav, nun, he, indicated the then current year of the Jewish calendar. As you probably all know, like each Hebrew letter has a numerical value. So taf chet means taf is 400, chet is 8, so it's 408, and taf 400, nun is 50, he is 5, so it's 455, meaning the Christian years 1648 and 1695. So he says that the verse "Vayisgor basa tachtena" was interpreted in the way that God closed up the good tidings of the arrival of the Messiah in the year 408, meaning 1648, only to like open it up in the year 455, meaning 1695. Little is known about the messianic commotion that Aaron describes here. As a matter of fact, his account is not only the longest, but also the most detailed description of its course of events and eventual disintegration that has been preserved. Said Rabbi Tzadok can be identified with the Sabbatian prophet Tzadok of Grodno, who was, according to the zealous opponent of Sabbatianism, Jacob Amden, nothing more than an illiterate distiller. The little surviving material on Tzadok's movement, all in all only 2 letters and a short missive, confirm the scriptural proof cited by Aaron and states explicitly that the expected Messiah was supposed to be Shabtai Tzvi, who is strikingly absent from Aaron's account. Even more so when considering that the connection between Tzadok and the Sabbatian movement can be easily inferred from Aaron's words. He refers his readers, when talking about events that took place in 1695, to a year that had been counted 30 years past. This betrays that he was not thinking about 1648, as the interpretation of the verse from Genesis implies, but about the Sabbatian commotion at its peak in 1665. However, when the day for which the Jews, according to Aaron, had intensively prepared for, finally arrived, their hopes quickly vanished into thin air, as he relates. Finally, after a long wait, the long-desired day had arrived. It was September 5th, which proved to be somewhat dark in the beginning, wherefore the rabbis lit their lamps with great joy and supposed that the great signs would be seen in the sky now. But while they were still hoping in vain, instead of a venomous haze, the sun broke through the clouds, and it turned out to be such a lovely day that all creatures, except for the Jews, were happy. With that, the repeated deceit became apparent, and the rabbis were only anxious about how they could palliate this deceit. The above-named Lithuanian Jew was excommunicated as one who is in league with the devil. A few years later in Uppsala, Aaron, now Johan Kemper, dealt once more with Rabbi Tzadok in the introduction to his Christian commentary on the Zohar. After having outlined several messianic calculations and failed messiah claimants, Kemper turns to the events of 1695. Ma me'uma hayata ben ha'Yehudim. What a commotion there was among the Jews. Did they not vacate their houses, and did they not sell everything to prepare provisions so that they could ascend with the Messiah to Jerusalem in peace and quiet? There was one unique man whose name was Rabbi Tzadok of Vilna, who was the head of and the main reason for this commotion. And his words proved that he was mistaken. He provided an abundance of proof and interpreted the verse, and he closed up the flesh Vasa instead thereof, Tachtena, to the effect that he concealed the glad tidings, Besorah, of the Messiah in the year 408, meaning 1648, which was mentioned above, and that he would wait to reveal it until the year 455, meaning 1695. And the second pillar on which this house was established was taken from the order of the prayers called Hoshanot, where it says, voice, give, salvation, give, Taf Nun Hey, 455. This means that the voice of the turtle dove, that is the great guide, meaning this Messiah, will be heard in the year 455. Similarly, they applied different standards and again different standards in the year 426, meaning 1666, regarding Shabtai Tzvi, as is well known. Kemper, the former Moses Aaron, again does not connect Tzadok's prophecies to Shabtai Tzvi. He merely states that both messianic upheavals were facilitated through change in the criteria for the arrival of the Messiah time and again. Apart from that, also the added new information is largely confirmed by the other extant sources on Tzadok. It is thus very likely, if not to say evident, that Aaron experienced the described messianic upheaval himself. However, he refrains from explicitly mentioning one of its most central elements, namely its Sabbatian dimension. This raises the question of the degree of Aaron's involvement in the Sabbatian movement. On the one hand, he is intimately familiar with the course of events of the described commotion, yet on the other hand, he seems to be strikingly ignorant of one of its main components. Are we really to believe that Aaron, respectively Kemper, was unaware of the Sabbatian dimension of Tzadok's prophecies? Or did he perhaps perceive them differently? A passage in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew suggests that Kemper, respectively Aaron, did not see Tzadok as the herald of Shabtai Tzvi's second coming, but as a Messiah claimant in his own right, as he explains to his readers. And here we see that Jesus' words prove to be true, for many have come and made themselves messiahs, like Ben Koziba and Shabtai Tzvi several years ago. And only recently, 9 years ago, Rabbi Tzadok in the city of Vilna. What was it that the schoolmaster Moses Aaron found appealing in Tzadok's teachings? The extant sources pertaining to Tzadok's prophecies reveal a strong devotional element. His followers are urged to atone for their sins, fast, give alms, say psalms, practice ritual immersion, pray with utmost concentration, and refrain from speaking about vain things in synagogue. Aaron's convert autobiography reveals a certain fascination with Lutheran religiousness. In addition, he portrays himself as not only as being anxious for devoutness and the pious practices it entailed, but also as someone who took great offense at other people's lack thereof. After describing the improper behavior of his co-religionists in synagogue on Judaism's single most important day of mourning, the 9th of Av, Moses Aaron adds, I reprehended them often on account of this, and I said that it was against the word of God and the Talmud, but I was derided thereupon. It has come to that with today's Jews that they keep the word of God and the Talmud when they wish to. If it does not please them, they deviate from both. Leaving the quotes of obvious polemical intent aside, this implies that Aaron had been at odds with his brethren's blatant disregard for the precepts of Jewish devoutness already before his messianic hopes were dashed. It could well be that he initially regarded their lack of religiosity to be the real reason that had withheld the promised redemption. Aaron at least relates that after the disintegration of Tzadok's movement, he himself continued to everyone's surprise to exercise all kinds of pious practices, including fasting and ritual immersions. This in turn suggests that he felt more attracted to the devotional component of Tzadok's teachings than to their theological implications. In any case, Aaron was not the only one who attempted to promote devotional behavior among his co-religionists and felt mocked on account of this. His contemporary, the cantor and scribe Yehuda Leib of Shelechov, for instance, blamed his co-religionists' lack of religious devoutness for holding back the redemption of Israel. Like Aaron, he lamented the lack of respect for religious functionaries like him, and particularly denounced the undignified behavior of his fellow Jews in synagogue. He writes, quote, "He, that is, Satan, induces our people to engage in idle chatter. As soon as they enter, the youngsters follow the example of their elders, prancing about like goats. If one comes to rebuke them, they mock him." End of quote. The historian Elisheva Kalebach has pointed out that said Yehuda Leib shared the messianic enthusiasm of his contemporaries without being himself a believer in Shabtai Tzvi. He acknowledged that the year 1666 had indeed been a time of grace when the Messiah had been supposed to arrive. Yet the redemption had, in his opinion, failed to materialize because of the sins of Israel. Maybe Aaron's understanding of Jewish history resembled the one put forward by Yehuda Leib. Perhaps he conceptualized the years 1648, 1666, and 1695 as potential and not necessarily interconnected moments for redemption that had not come to fruition because of the lack of devoutness among the Jews. That this might have been the case can be deduced from Aaron's deliberations on the messianic significance of the year 1648 as he expounded it about 15 years later as Johan Kemper in Uppsala. After quoting an excerpt from the Zohar in which it is stated that the dead would rise in the 408th year of the 6th millennium, which caused the famous sage Rabbi Elazar ben Arach to be distressed, Kemper explains. He, that is Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, grieved because the general conversion had been postponed for such a long time. He foresaw that there would be harsh pogroms against the Jews in the year 5408, that is 1648, which was fulfilled, as the Jews themselves know, for many thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in Ukraine in that year. Until today, they have a fast day in Poland that they call 20th of Sivan in memory of this pogrom, that they also call the pogrom of Khmelnytsky, because he was the leader who commanded the murderers. And they call these days the birth pangs of the Messiah. And this time was certainly predestined to be the time of their return to the belief in the Messiah. However, since they did not return, God commuted the birth pangs of the Messiah, meaning great and bitter distress came upon them, yet they still did not return. Kemper, by then a devout Lutheran believer, naturally could no longer conceptualize the year 1648 as one of the potential yet not actualized dates for the arrival of the Jewish Messiah, as he, as Moses Aaron, had probably done. However, he still expressed fundamentally the same idea, albeit in a Christianized version. He was, by all appearances, convinced that 1648 had indeed been predestined to be the year of the general conversion of the Jews to Christianity. But after his former co-religionists had failed to accept the belief in Jesus, they brought suffering upon themselves, whereas the date of their conversion was once more postponed. The assumption that Aaron conceptualized Jewish messianism in a similar way rests, of course, to some degree on speculation. Yet we should allow for the possibility that there were individuals in the 17th century, like Yehuda Leib and possibly Moses Aaron, whose idea of Jewish messianism was not necessarily bound to the person of Shabtai Tzvi, but rather to Jewish devotion. When Moses Aaron embraced Christianity in 1696, he abandoned Judaism in favor of Lutheran Christianity. And here I skip the intriguing story of how and why Moses Aaron converted to Christianity, with which I extensively deal in my book project. So returning to our project, the Baptist Johann Christian Jacob, the later Johan Kemper, was received into a church that perceived itself, perhaps unsurprisingly, as the one true, universal, and ancient faith, based on the unchangeable and eternally true written word of God. When he settled in the Kingdom of Sweden, sometime late in 1698, he found himself in one of the most powerful states in Europe that considered itself to be the champion and protector of Lutheranism. In line with this, Swedish society was characterized by strict adherence to Lutheran orthodoxy. It was even forbidden for so-called heretics, that is, in the first instance Catholics and Calvinists, but naturally also Jews, to reside in Sweden and her dominions. The ecclesiastical intellectual center of the empire was Uppsala, home to the head of the official state church and to the kingdom's most eminent university. The main mission of the university was the academic training of future public officials, including church ministers and administrative officers, who would be loyal to the realm and steadfast in their Lutheran convictions. Characterized by relative doctrinal unity, Lutheran orthodoxy was deeply distrustful of everything considered to be new. Its official representatives, who were without exception university educated, zealously strove for the preservation of doctrinal purity and were naturally hostile towards syncretism, let alone heresy. Because of its almost neurotic fear of novelty, syncretism, and heresy, Lutheran orthodoxy was interested in converting Jews only in theory. Its theologians perceived other religions, first and foremost, as existential threats. Consequently, they occupied themselves with protecting their own faith against everything that they perceived as dangerous. This found its expression not least in a profound suspicion towards outsiders, former outsiders, and everyone who was perceived as diverging in any way possible from narrowly defined orthodoxy. As a convert from Judaism, Johan Kemper was certainly not spared the experience of suspicion. It is by no means a coincidence that he deemed it necessary to approach the royal chancellery with a copy of his convert autobiography before putting himself forward as lecturer of rabbinics at the University of Uppsala. The account of his conversion served him, so to speak, as a certificate of orthodoxy. Moreover, it is noteworthy that the leadership of the university was above all concerned with Kemper's fear of God and seriousness with regards to Lutheran doctrine. Equally telling is the fact that Kemper informed the university in 1704 that he had decided to marry in order to avert all suspicion of weakness in matters of faith. The deep-rooted suspicion towards Kemper as a convert, or rather the outright fear of everything that could only remotely be perceived as a danger to Sweden's state religion, is best illustrated by the following incident. In August 1711, Kemper offered to teach a class on the rites and customs of Judaism. When the academic senate discussed Kemper's request, the designated professor of Oriental languages rose to speak. If the venerated senate concludes that Rabbi Kemper can be trusted with such a course, I will not oppose this request. It is, however, my humble opinion that this is such a delicate matter to touch that someone who is not well versed in both dogmatic and exegetical theology can himself easily go astray and even lead others to hold obscene opinions. In other words, the professor considered Kemper, who had by then been a follower of Lutheranism for more than 15 years, of which he had spent 10 in Uppsala, as neither trustworthy nor theologically educated enough to teach such a course. The members of the Senate shared his view and concurred in the professor's opinion. They decided that Kemper should not be granted the permission he had asked for, but continue with his private classes as usual. Since Kemper could not be trusted, he was never officially employed at the university. Nominally, he was a freelancer, and administratively he remained a student throughout the entire 15 years of his sojourn in Uppsala. The rather low social rank that went along with this arrangement is best illustrated by the seat assigned to the private tutor in church. To his great irritation, Kemper was initially forced to sit with the regular students. Although he was by all appearances soon assigned a more respectable seat, he brought up the matter again and again until the Senate finally allowed him to sit behind the adjunct teachers. At the same time, Kemper was subjected to the watchful eye and to the will of the professors of Oriental languages. Financially, he was forced to rely on a meager student scholarship and the apparently very little money he earned with his classes. Although he was granted a second royal stipend after a few months after his arrival, Kemper's 15 years in Uppsala were characterized by financial hardship, as his countless petitions to the university attest. He asked for advances on his scholarships, tax exemptions, interest-free loans, or simply for charity. In one such petition of 1704, he wrote to the Archbishop of Uppsala and Vice Chancellor of the university. My great distress forces me to come before you fatherly reverence. I can no longer withhold what aggrieves me. Despite all my work, I do not have my daily bread. The students are a large part of the year away from the academy. Therefore, I have had to find myself without money and head over ears in debt. Besides asking for financial support, Kemper resorted to less acceptable means. He operated a pub in his house, selling his homemade alcohol. This was tolerated as long as it did not interfere with public order, which unfortunately was not always the case. In May 1714, he was summoned before the academic senate because his illegal but tolerated endeavor had repeatedly caused trouble. The minutes of the senate report. Rabbi Kemper was reproached for the disturbance he had caused time and again by selling beer and spirits at prohibited times. And second, by not letting the watch enter when it is ordered arrive to find out which people sit and drink at his place at nighttime. The Senate reprimanded the destitute part-time distiller severely. Should he one more time serve drinks at prohibited times or deny the watch access to his house, he would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. 2 months later, the royal government allowed him to assume the vacant post of the university's book auctioneer. Quote, in one of other public means, we could not find something more fitting than granting him the freedom and the privilege to organize the book auctions, which is a post that does not immediately fall under the academy, unquote. However, at this point, Kemper was already deeply in debt, and his new post did not seem to have yielded any significant revenues. Kemper, of course, had converted and come to Sweden with entirely different expectations. Like many converts of the late 17th and the early 18th century, he soon had to realize that his main asset was his, so to speak, naturally acquired expert knowledge in Jewish matters. However, his expertise counted relatively little when confronted with the erudition of professional academics. Although it is quite likely that his practical knowledge of rabbinic literature surpassed that of most learned Christians by far, Kemper lacked, in their opinion, the foundations necessary to utilize his learning properly. This is to say, his familiarity with Christian theology was, from their perspective, superficial at best. Moreover, he was ignorant of Latin, the academic language of most of Europe. Naturally, Kemper could hardly make up for this. He never managed to master Latin properly, at least not by early modern standards. But since succeeding at the university was for him an existential matter, if not the only way to ameliorate his situation, he needed to find other ways to advance his career. As a newcomer to Swedish society, who was perceived by the Academy's Orientalists as a rival, he sought to establish himself as both a Swedish academic and a foreign expert. In line with this, he introduced himself to the university not with his baptismal name, Johan Christian Jakob, but with his Jewish birth name. In March 1701, which marks his first appearance in the minutes of the Academic Senate, he is described as a Jew converted to the evangelical religion named Moses Aaron. At some point during the following months, he decided to change his name to the Swedish-sounding Johan Kemper. In an entry of December 1701, he is without any further remark for the first time called the converted Jew, Mr. Johan Kemper. To highlight his expertise in Jewish matters, which was no longer self-evident after his name change, Kemper invested himself with the title of a rabbi. Indeed, this is how he was addressed in the minutes of the Academic Senate for the first time exactly 1 year later in December 1702. Moreover, he often furnished his letters with Hebrew words and expressions, giving them an exotic touch and conveying his field of expertise in quite an obvious way. Kemper's claim to be the undisputed expert in Hebrew and everything rabbinic soon led to conflict with the professor of Oriental languages and other members of the academy. When Kemper was summoned before the Senate in December 1705 to remind him that all his writings were subject to the censorship of the chair of Oriental languages, the convert retorted confidently that the one censoring his works needed to know Hebrew at least as well as he did. The holder of said chair asked thereupon incredulously what kind of incomprehensible secrets the convert had hidden in his works. Explaining that his skillful and often unique use of the Hebrew language was not obvious to everybody, Kemper aroused the objection of yet another professor. The two professors went on record saying that there was nothing in the convert's writings that they could not understand with the help of a dictionary. Kemper was thereupon admonished to control his language and reminded that he was not exempt from the royal decree that stipulated that all writings intended for printing were subject to censorship. I would like to pause here and say a few things about the knowledge of Hebrew among learned Christians at the beginning of the 18th century. Early 18th century Swedish academics had usually a good command of Hebrew and often also of Aramaic, even if they were not professional Hebraists or Orientalists, as they were often called back then. The same was true for the university-educated clergy of Sweden. As a matter of fact, Hebrew was a mandatory subject at Swedish grammar schools. At the University of Uppsala, it was customary at special occasions to deliver speeches in Hebrew. Kemper choosing to compose his works in Hebrew was thus only partly owed to the fact that his knowledge of Latin was insufficient. Equally important for him was embodying the ideal of the perfect Hebraist, therewith impressing and maybe also intimidating his learned rivals at the University of Uppsala. Hence, tragic as the experience of suspicion, hardship, and rivalry was for Kemper, it ironically seemed to have facilitated the composition of his magnum opus. His voluminous, all-encompassing Christian commentary on the Zohar. To begin with, although he nominally donated his compositions to the university library, he was endowed with relatively generous amounts of money whenever he submitted a part of his Zohar commentary. Here you can see the title pages of the 3 volumes of his commentary on the Zohar. The first part being called Mate Moshe or Makel Yaakov, like mixing his Jewish birth name, Moshe Aaron, and this, his baptismal name, Johan Christian Jakob. And here at the bottom, he signs Anochi Moshe Kohen Mikraka Le'et Ata Johan Kemper. And this is the second part, and again he mentions which composed Rabbi Moshe Kahana Mikraka Nikra Bein HaMeshechim Yochanan Kemper, which has composed Rabbi Moshe Kahana from Krakow, who's called among the Christians Yochanan Kemper. And again here you can see Yochanan Kemper. So in my opinion, Kemper pursued a long-term strategy with his exegetical work, namely academic prestige, which could eventually secure him a tenured position. So how does one enhance one's status and gain prestige in the academic world? Through writing academic treatises. In line with this, Kemper emphasized to the governing body of the university that several professors had urged him, quote, to reveal the hidden treasures that are concealed in the books of Kabbalah, unquote. When submitting the first part of his work in 1710, he wrote with great pride that he had shown his treatise to quite a few very erudite professors from the departments of theology and philosophy who had expressed their pleasure and satisfaction thereover. Moreover, he explained that the Zohar, as the most ancient rabbinic book, contained marvelous things regarding the truth and the strength of the Christian religion, for one could see there that the belief regarding the Messiah held by the old Jewish synagogue was congruent with one held by the Christians. However, in accordance with his overall goal, Kemper was not thinking of Christianity in general, but of Sweden's Lutheran state religion. In line with this, he explained that his work dealt not only with the Trinity, but also with the humiliated and exalted states of the Messiah. This is to say that it espoused the genuinely Lutheran Christological doctrine of these two states of Christ. This doctrine resulted from a particularly uncompromising understanding of the hypostatic union, meaning the union of divinity and humanity in Christ. It claims that Christ, in his humiliated state, either voluntarily divests himself of his divine attributes or exercises them in a concealed manner. As opposed to this, in his exalted state, he reveals himself in his full divine glory. Kemper found this doctrine confirmed in the Zohar and assigned Zoharic expressions to the two states. Terms that imply divinity, strength, and masculinity pertain to the exaltation, whereas terms that indicate suffering, weakness, and femininity apply to his humiliation. Showing that all this is found in the Zohar, Kemper boasted that his work is like a key to Kabbalah. Såsom en nyckel till Kabbalah. Before I explain what Kemper means by that, I need to mention briefly that the conversion of the Jews is, if at all, an object of secondary importance for Kemper. In the letter from which I have quoted here, Kemper only says that if his work would be printed and brought to foreign countries, it could not only be beneficiary to the Christians alone, but also give the erring an opportunity to return to Christ. Kemper's conceptualization of Kabbalah and his reading of the Zohar is, of course, more complex than what I can say here in the remaining time. And I would like to refer you to my book project, where I deal with this set of topics comprehensively. Here it suffices to say that Kabbalah is for Kemper the primeval tradition of ancient Israel in encrypted form. As such, it is essentially identical with the doctrines of Lutheran Christianity, where that same ancient tradition has been preserved, or rather restored, in an exoteric manner. Showing this is the main aim of his work, thereby reassuring Lutheran Orthodoxy of its self-perception of being the one true primeval religion of old. This notion of Kabbalah was not particular to Kemper. It developed in the wake of a late 17th century Protestant debate on the value of Kabbalah. Influential theologians postulated the existence of a sound ancient Kabbalah identical with Christianity and a corrupted new Kabbalah identical with Judaism. Kemper fully adhered to this notion of Kabbalah. Hence, he aimed at showing that the beliefs held by ancient Israel as supposedly found in the Zohar were identical with the tenets of Lutheran Orthodoxy. According to him, the ancient tradition of the Hebrews, meaning Kabbalah, has been preserved in its purest form in Lutheran Christianity, since it is the sole faith based upon the most important written document of the allegedly sound ancient Kabbalah, the New Testament. However, vestiges of that primordial tradition can be found in encoded form in other ancient writings, such as the Zohar. Thus, Kemper saw it as his task to uncover these scattered remnants and make their alleged Christian essence shine through once again. He achieved this by approaching his source text in the same fashion as Lutheran Orthodox exegetes approached the Old Testament. This is to say, he developed a system of interpretation in line with the most fundamental principle of Lutheran hermeneutics, omnia et in omnibus Christus, meaning he utilized the numerous names for Christ that Lutherans derived from the Bible as points of departure. And with their help, he identified additional names of Christ in the Zohar. In a complicated system of co-references, he ultimately succeeded in applying almost every noun and every name found in the Zohar to Jesus, realizing in many respects the exegetical and polemical potential of previously developed ideas, surpassing his predecessors in scope and comprehensiveness. Kemper was fully aware of this and boasted to the Senate when submitting the second part of his magnum opus. I hope that everyone who reads this work of mine will understand that nothing in this vein has ever been done before, neither by Christians who are acknowledgeable in Kabbalah, nor by any converted Jew. Kemper's strategy was only partly successful. His work achieved a great deal of acclaim from Swedish academics, but it did not help him to accomplish his aim to secure him an academic position and therewith a steady income in the long run. However, this was, in my opinion, less connected to any reservations regarding Kemper as a convert, but to the overall desperate, outright chaotic state of Sweden due to the Great Northern War. But this is a topic for another talk. Let me summarize and conclude. Johan Kemper, the former Moses Aaron of Kraków, is an outright paradigmatic case of what the Italian historian Edoardo Grandi has termed the exceptional normal. Of course, his story is unique and certainly exceptional, since he wrote a voluminous Lutheran commentary on the Zohar in Hebrew. However, Kemper's story is also paradigmatic for his age. The story of his life as a Jew offers insights into the world of the secondary elite and how its members experienced the messianic uproars of the late 17th century. As opposed to this, the story of his life as a Christian illustrates that boundary crossing came at a high price in the early modern period. Conversion from Judaism to Christianity usually meant moving down the social ladder. This is in sharp contrast to what Satan had promised to the fictitious Seidel in Singer's story, with which I have opened this lecture. In Singer's story, Satan advises Seidel, quote, "The Gentiles will make you a priest. You'll continue to study, to wear a long coat and skull cap. The only difference will be that instead of being stuck away in a remote village among Jews who hate you and your accomplishments, praying in a sunken hole of a study house, you will live in a large city, preach in a luxurious church where an organ will play and where your congregation will consist of men of stature," unquote. Historically, this was partly true, as the story of Kemper shows. The Cathedral of Uppsala might have been luxurious and was certainly equipped with an organ. However, Kemper never preached there, but was forced to sit behind the adjunct teachers whenever he came there. For conversion in his lifetime indeed often entailed the continuation of one's Jewish life, however, under incomparably more difficult conditions. As a matter of fact, and very tragically, if I may say so, everything that Rabbi Johan Kemper of Uppsala gained as a Christian, the schoolmaster Moses Aaron of Kraków could have had as a Jew, without the social disruption a conversion usually carried. Even worse, and in sharp contrast to Singer's Seidel, Kemper as a convert was exposed to the suspicion and distrust of his Lutheran co-religionists. Like many other converts, he was on the one hand forced to distance himself as much as possible from his Jewish past, but at the other hand needed to emphasize it again and again, since it was, so to speak, his main asset as a Christian. Thus, he was forced to walk a tightrope. He needed to be both an inconspicuous Christian and an expert Jew at the same time. This in turn made him come into conflict with Christian Hebraists, which made his situation even more difficult. Far from the dreams of grandeur that the fictitious Seidel cherished and could not bring to fruition because of his own perfectionism and vanity, Johan Kemper dashed against all the obstacles put in his way, ending his life as a self-proclaimed rabbi in service of those who did not need one, and as Johann to a people that would have seen him as a traitor. Thank you.